The Cuban Missile Crisis, also known as the October Crisis, the Caribbean Crisis, or the Missile Scare, was a 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union over Soviet ballistic missiles deployed in Cuba. It played out on television worldwide and was the closest the Cold War came to escalating into a full-scale nuclear war, in response to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961, and the presence of American Jupiter ballistic missiles in Italy and Turkey against the USSR with Moscow within range. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev decided to agree to Cuba's request to place nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter future harassment of Cuba. An agreement was reached during a secret meeting between Khrushchev and Fidel Castro in July, and construction on a number of missile launch facilities started later that summer. An election was underway in the U.S., and the White House had denied Republican charges that it was ignoring dangerous Soviet missiles 90 miles from Florida. These missile preparations were confirmed when an Air Force U-2 spy plane produced clear photographic evidence of medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missile facilities. The United States established a military blockade to prevent further missiles from entering Cuba. It announced that they would not permit offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba and demanded that the weapons already in Cuba be dismantled and returned to the USSR. After a long time of tense negotiations, an agreement was reached between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Publicly, the Soviets would dismantle their offensive weapons in Cuba and return them to the Soviet Union, subject to United Nations verification. In exchange for a U.S. public declaration and agreement never to invade Cuba without direct provocation. Secretly, the U.S. also agreed that it would dismantle all U.S.-built Jupiter MRBMs, which were deployed in Turkey and Italy against the Soviet Union but were not known to the public. When all offensive missiles and Ilyushin Il-28 light bombers had been withdrawn from Cuba, the blockade was formally ended on November 20, 1962. The negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union pointed out the necessity of a quick, clear, and direct communication line between Washington and Moscow. As a result, the Moscow-Washington hotline was established. A series of agreements sharply reduced U.S.-Soviet tensions for the following years. Earlier actions by the United States. The United States was concerned about an expansion of communism, and a Latin American country allying openly with the USSR was regarded as unacceptable, given the U.S.-Soviet enmity since the end of World War II. Such an involvement would also directly defy the Monroe Doctrine, a U.S. policy which, while limiting the United States' involvement with European colonies and European affairs, held that European powers ought not to have involvement with states in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. had been embarrassed publicly by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, which had been launched under President John F. Kennedy by CIA-trained forces of Cuban exiles. Afterward, former President Eisenhower told Kennedy that the failure of the Bay of Pigs will embolden the Soviets to do something that they would otherwise not do. The half-hearted invasion left Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and his advisors with the impression that Kennedy was indecisive and, as one Soviet advisor wrote, too young, intellectual, not prepared well for decision-making in crisis situations. Too intelligent and too weak. U.S. covert operations continued in 1961 with the unsuccessful Operation Mongoose. In addition, Khrushchev's impression of Kennedy's weakness was confirmed by the president's soft response during the Berlin crisis of 1961. Particularly the building of the Berlin Wall. Speaking to Soviet officials in the aftermath of the crisis, Khrushchev asserted, "I know for certain that Kennedy doesn't have a strong background, nor, generally speaking, does he have the courage to stand up to a serious challenge." He also told his son Sergei that on Cuba, Kennedy would make a fuss, make more of a fuss, and then agree. In January 1962, General Edward Lansdale described plans to overthrow the Cuban government in a top-secret report addressed to President Kennedy and officials involved with Operation Mongoose. CIA agents or pathfinders from the Special Activities Division were to be infiltrated into Cuba to carry out sabotage and organization, including radio broadcasts. In February 1962, the U.S. launched an embargo against Cuba, and Lansdale presented a 26-page, top-secret timetable for implementation of the overthrow of the Cuban government, mandating that guerrilla operations begin in August and September, and in the first 2 weeks of October, open revolt and overthrow of the communist regime. Balance of power. When Kennedy ran for president in 1960, one of his key election issues was an alleged missile gap, with the Soviets leading. In fact, the U.S. led the Soviets by a wide margin that would only increase. In 1961, the Soviets had only 4 intercontinental ballistic missiles. By October 1962, they may have had a few dozen, although some intelligence estimates were as high as 75. The U.S., on the other hand, had 170 ICBMs and was quickly building more. It also had 8 George Washington and Ethan Allen-class ballistic missile submarines with the capability to launch 16 Polaris missiles each, with a range of 1,500 nautical miles. Khrushchev increased the perception of a missile gap when he loudly boasted to the world that the USSR was building missiles like sausages, whose numbers and capabilities actually were nowhere close to his assertions. The Soviet Union did have medium-range ballistic missiles in quantity, about 700 of them. However, these were very unreliable and inaccurate. The U.S. had a considerable advantage in total number of nuclear warheads at the time and in all the technologies needed to deliver them accurately. The U.S. also led in missile defensive capabilities, naval and air power, but the USSR enjoyed a 2-to-1 advantage in conventional ground forces, more pronounced in field guns and tanks. Soviet deployment of missiles in Cuba. In May 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was persuaded by the idea of countering the United States' growing lead in developing and deploying strategic missiles by placing Soviet intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. Despite the misgivings of the Soviet ambassador in Havana, Alexander Ivanovich Alexeyev, who argued that Castro would not accept the deployment of these missiles, Khrushchev faced a strategic situation where the U.S. was perceived to have a splendid first strike capability that put the Soviet Union at a huge disadvantage. In 1962, the Soviets had only 20 ICBMs capable of delivering nuclear warheads to the U.S. from inside the Soviet Union. The poor accuracy and reliability of these missiles raised serious doubts about their effectiveness. A newer, more reliable generation of ICBMs would only become operational after 1965. Therefore, Soviet nuclear capability in 1962 placed less emphasis on ICBMs than on medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles. These missiles could hit American allies and most of Alaska from Soviet territory but not the contiguous 48 states of the U.S. Graham Allison, the director of Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, points out, the Soviet Union could right the nuclear imbalance by deploying new ICBMs on its own soil. In order to meet the threat it faced in 1962, 1963, and 1964, it had very few options. Moving existing nuclear weapons to locations from which they could reach American targets was one. A second reason Soviet missiles were deployed to Cuba was because Khrushchev wanted to bring West Berlin, the American, British, French-controlled democratic enclave within communist East Germany, into the Soviet orbit. The East Germans and Soviets considered Western control over a portion of Berlin a grave threat to East Germany. For this reason, among others, Khrushchev made West Berlin a central battlefield of the Cold War. Khrushchev believed that if the U.S. did nothing over the missile deployments in Cuba, he could muscle the West out of Berlin using said missiles as a deterrent to Western countermeasures in Berlin. If the U.S. tried to bargain with the Soviets after becoming aware of the missiles, Khrushchev could demand trading the missiles for West Berlin. Since Berlin was strategically more important than Cuba, the trade would be a win for Khrushchev. President Kennedy recognized this. The advantage is, from Khrushchev's point of view, he takes a great chance, but there are quite some rewards to it. Khrushchev was also reacting in part to the nuclear threat of obsolescent Jupiter, intermediate-range ballistic missiles which the U.S. had installed in Turkey during April 1962. In early 1962, a group of Soviet military and missile construction specialists accompanied an agricultural delegation to Havana. They obtained a meeting with Cuban leader Fidel Castro. The Cuban leadership had a strong expectation that the U.S. would invade Cuba again, and they enthusiastically approved the idea of installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. However, according to another source, Fidel Castro objected to the missiles deployment that would have made him look like a Soviet puppet, but was persuaded that missiles in Cuba would be an irritant to the U.S. and help the interests of the entire socialist camp. Further, the deployment would include short-range tactical weapons that would provide a nuclear umbrella for attacks upon the island. By May, Khrushchev and Castro agreed to place strategic nuclear missiles secretly in Cuba. Like Castro, Khrushchev felt that a U.S. invasion of Cuba was imminent, and that to lose Cuba would do great harm to the communist cause, especially in Latin America. He said he wanted to confront the Americans with more than words. The logical answer was missiles. The Soviets maintained their tight secrecy, writing their plans longhand, which were approved by Rodion and Malinowski on July 4 and Khrushchev on July 7. From the very beginning, the Soviets' operation entailed elaborate denial and deception, known in the USSR as maskirovka. All of the planning and preparation for transporting and deploying the missiles were carried out in the utmost secrecy, with only a very few told the exact nature of the mission. Even the troops detailed for the mission were given misdirection, told they were headed for a cold region and outfitted with ski boots, fleece-lined parkas, and other winter equipment. The Soviet code name was Operation Anadyr. Anadyr was also the name of a river flowing into the Bering Sea, the name of the capital of Chukotsky district, and a bomber base in the Far Eastern region. All these were meant to conceal the program from both internal and external audiences. Specialists in missile construction under the guise of machine operators, irrigation specialists, and agricultural specialists arrived in July. A total of 43,000 foreign troops would ultimately be brought in. Marshal Sergei Boryusov, chief of the Soviet rocket forces, led a survey team that visited Cuba. He told Khrushchev that the missiles would be concealed and camouflaged by the palm trees. The Cuban leadership was further upset when in September the U.S. Congress approved U.S. Joint Resolution 230, which expressed Congress's resolve to prevent the creation of an externally supported military establishment. On the same day, the U.S. announced a major military exercise in the Caribbean, PHIBRIGLEX-62, which Cuba denounced as a deliberate provocation and proof that the U.S. planned to invade Cuba. The Soviet leadership believed, based on the perception of Kennedy's lack of confidence during the Bay of Pigs invasion, that he would avoid confrontation and accept the missiles as a fait accompli. On September 11, the Soviet Union publicly warned that a U.S. attack on Cuba or on Soviet ships carrying supplies to the island would mean war. The Soviets continued the Maskirovka program to conceal their actions in Cuba. They repeatedly denied that the weapons being brought into Cuba were offensive in nature. On September 7, Soviet ambassador to the United States Anatoly Dobryna assured United States ambassador to the United Nations Adlai Stevenson that the USSR was supplying only defensive weapons to Cuba. On September 11, the Telegraph No Agentstvo Sovetskogo Soyuza announced that the Soviet Union had no need or intention to introduce offensive nuclear missiles into Cuba. On October 13, Dobryna was questioned by former Undersecretary of State Chester Bowles about whether the Soviets planned to put offensive weapons in Cuba. He denied any such plans. On October 17, Soviet embassy official Georgy Bolshakov brought President Kennedy a personal message from Khrushchev reassuring him that, under no circumstances, would surface-to-surface missiles be sent to Cuba. As early as August 1962, the U.S. suspected the Soviets of building missile facilities in Cuba. During that month, its intelligence services gathered information about sightings by ground observers of Russian-built MiG-21 fighters and Il-28 light bombers. U-2 spy planes found S-75D Vena surface-to-air missile sites at 8 different locations. CIA Director John A. McConnell was suspicious. Sending anti-aircraft missiles into Cuba, he reasoned, made sense only if Moscow intended to use them to shield a base for ballistic missiles aimed at the United States. On August 10, he wrote a memo to President Kennedy in which he guessed that the Soviets were preparing to introduce ballistic missiles into Cuba. With important congressional elections scheduled for November, the crisis became enmeshed in American politics. On August 31, Senator Kenneth Keating, who received his information from Cuban exiles in Florida, warned on the Senate floor that the Soviet Union may be constructing a missile base in Cuba. He charged the Kennedy administration was covering up a major threat to the U.S. Air Force. General Curtis LeMay presented a pre-invasion bombing plan to Kennedy in September, while spy flights and minor military harassment from U.S. forces at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base were the subject of continual Cuban diplomatic complaints to the U.S. government. The first consignment of R-12 missiles arrived on the night of September 8, followed by a second on September 16. The R-12 was an intermediate-range ballistic missile, capable of carrying a thermonuclear warhead. It was a single-stage, road-transportable, surface-launched, storable liquid propellant-fueled missile that could deliver a megaton-class nuclear weapon. The Soviets were building 9 sites, 6 for R-12 medium-range missiles with an effective range of 2,000 kilometers and 3 for R-14 intermediate-range ballistic missiles with a maximum range of 4,500 kilometers. Cuba positioning. On October 7, Cuban President Osvaldo Dorticos spoke at the UN General Assembly. "If we are attacked, we will defend ourselves.